We have had just a great response. I see so many names that are now making this a regular part of your Wednesdays. So again, thank you for joining us. I'm Tasha Davenport, Deputy Executive Director and Chief Operations Officer for CASBO. And today I am joined by Molly McGee-Hewitt, our Executive Director, as well as Sarah Botches, our Chief Governmental Relations Officer. And Molly's going to do the introduction for our super special guest, the giant 8-foot-tall gentleman there, touching the ceiling in the background. Molly will be giving that introduction. Before we do, just a quick note that, again, we're going to continue our summer speaker series for the next foreseeable future. There's so many topics to discuss. We've got next week a macro and micro view of the impact of the pandemic from a couple of our CBOs. We have some legal perspectives coming up on many of the issues that our schools are facing. And we'll just, again, continue down the path with relevant information as it becomes available to us. We are recording today's session, and so you can receive this afterwards as well as the PowerPoint. And we will be having, as Sarah mentioned earlier, have a moderator who can help us with the question and answers, both in the text box, and then we'll allow time at the end for a great conversation with John. So no further ado, I'll turn it over to Molly.
Series. We're so glad that you're all with us, and we hope that you are surviving and hopefully thriving in what you're doing out there. So I have the pleasure today to introduce another person who probably needs no introduction. I don't think you could be anybody in school business or in education in California and not know John Gray. John is probably what I would call the guru of gurus of school finance these days. He and School Services have been partners with CASBO since day one, I think, in terms of what they do with us and what they do for us. So John, again, like Mike a few weeks ago, has been in your shoes. He has been in a school district, so he knows what it's like on the ground. And also he's been with School Services for several years. So without any further ado, I will introduce my friend and my colleague and someone I respect significantly, John Gray. Welcome, John.
Well, thank you very much, Molly, especially for that kind introduction. As you know, we've been friends a very long time, and Molly's someone that I consider as one of my trusted advisors. It's always good to have someone you can go to and talk through issues that it's pretty hard to talk with just anybody. And so thank you for your friendship over the years. You've been a longtime friend of School Services. My predecessor, Ron Bennett, one of the things he always told me when I became president is when Molly calls, whatever the request is, the answer is the same. Yes, ma'am. So at School Services, you're our professional organization, CASBO. You've been my professional organization for about 30 years. And so anytime I have the opportunity to work with you, Molly, and your team, Tasha, Sarah, we always jump at it. So thanks for having me, and I'm honored to be here. Okay, so why don't I just start then? So I'm guessing you all want to talk about what's happening with the economics with our country, our state, but more importantly with school districts. So I brought some slides that if we get stuck, I'll have them pop up. They're always a good crutch. But I think I'd like to start off by setting the environment and the circumstances we find ourselves in today. And if you go back to January, it's not very long ago, just a few months ago, we were in a much different position. But it wasn't the greatest position in the world either. We'd just gone through a long period of getting large influxes of new money, new unrestricted money through the LCFF. And come January, things were kind of petering out. Our economy was booming in California and at the nation, yet it felt like for California school districts, it almost felt like a recession because we got the governor's proposal. It was a pretty meager COLA, not enough in my mind. And based on the stats we have to cover just basic operations like increased costs of doing business, energy, trash, step and column, medical benefits, and that sort of thing. But now, sitting here today, we're probably looking back at January as the good old days, right? So what feels different to me now than what we found ourselves in the last recession, there's a couple of things. And if you read the LAO report, they talked about school district reserves being much bigger now than they were during the last recession. But what I would like to highlight is it's true, our reserves statewide, and yours may not be, that's just statewide averages, tend to be higher now. And we learned to do that through that last great recession. But the other parts of the economy and the economic school districts find themselves in are a bit different. Leading up to that last recession, we didn't have that big giant boom that we had heading into this recession where it was always new money. And new money, as we all know, can cover a lot of sins. But heading into the last recession, we were used to not getting big lump sums of money coming in ongoing. And pretty much our budgets were aligned, meaning if not exactly balanced, we didn't have these large deficits. But going into this recession, we had a lot of things happening to us. This first slide is, you can just see enrollment over this time. So a lot of you are already at declining enrollment. A combination of that and the increased pensions, the cost of just maintaining what we did the year before, most districts, even though they were sitting on larger ending fund balances, their skis were already kind of headed downhill. We were seeing deficit spending, and a lot of districts in that third year out were lucky to have their 3% reserve. So this hit us really fast, kind of came out of nowhere. We've never just shut down the economy like we did this time. And it hit us at absolutely the wrong time for planning. I mean, we're all sitting here in May, and we get news in late May. We had early warnings in March and April that things were going to be pretty tough. So our flexibility for saving money, planning for the future, it was pretty limited. There's some things we could do for this year, hiring freezes, cutting off purchase orders, trying to get that ending fund balance up a little bit higher than projected. But we didn't really have a lot of flexibility because it happened so late in the year. And we're also standing a little bit flat-footed for next year, right? It's almost the end of the year. We passed the March 15th notice. There might be an August layoff window. Right now, I think that's probably likely. But our reality is if we hit the right number in March, and we can't, not like we can go and increase class size language and contracts unilaterally. And so there might be a little flexibility with the August layoff window, especially if we didn't staff appropriately or utilize the March layoff. But there isn't that potpourri of solutions just because of the timing we find ourselves in. And so I've spent a lot of time these last few days talking with school districts about individual issues. And we all know that long-term solutions to a long-term downturn, and that's going to be the key, is how long we stay downturn. It's really hard to balance our budget on classified staff, administrators, recognizing that when we're declining enrollment, the lion's share of our budgets are in certificated staffing. And so a lot of it depends on collective bargaining, and depending on where you're at, that may or may not be an option. So if for 2021 you're already open, you've been to the table, you've had those discussions, you might be able to figure out some solutions at the bargaining table that will help you through next year. But you're going to have a willing participant, right? During the last recession, a lot of districts with very positive relations were able to hit the table early on and say, look, things are going to get bad. If we can do small things now, maybe we don't have to do as big of things later. But again, that is contingent on having a willing partner. And I know some districts are doing that now. And you do have some flexibility beyond the 180 days, but most schools start in August, and a lot of those days are at the beginning. So if you're not there yet, you might not have a lot of flexibility there. So we're in a tough place as far as the timing and what we can actually do next year. And so we can talk about some of those things in more detail. So Sarah, this is a declining enrollment slide, and you can see the regions of the state. And here's another wild card. What's the COVID-19 crisis going to do to enrollment in general? What's the migration to private schools, maybe charter schools, or what's the migration out of state? And so I think next year is going to be a real tough year to project our enrollment and our ADA. So, but this was a problem that existed prior to COVID-19. I think COVID-19 exacerbates that a bit. So if you go to the next slide, Sarah. And as you all know, special ed, the fact that the population's growing, funding isn't keeping up, those were all existing conditions that we were living with going into this crisis. So if you go to the next slide, Sarah, I'd take a minute on this. So I've been around a long time. I started in 1991. By the way, in 1991, the PERS rate was 0. That was a long time ago. And if you went to our May Revise workshop, you saw this slide, and we believe in recycling slides. But I think it illustrates a pretty good point. The numbers on the left-hand side, those brown arrows, were the Great Recession that we went through. And on the right is where we see ourselves now. And so that red number, as we talked about at our workshop, is a projection. That's from the Federal Reserve Bank. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, they have their projections too, and they're not the same, but they're pretty close. So the key thing is it's hitting us a lot harder and a lot faster. Last recession, it took 2 years to get to the bottom of the trough, is what I will call it, in our funding. And the thing that made the last Great Recession so difficult, we were like in this malaise for years. We just never seemed to come out of it. So we took the cuts up front the first 2 years, and we just never restored anything. We got little tiny bumps, we got flat funding, and so it really made it tough, and we had some very tough years. The key to the numbers on the right is how fast we recover, and we talked about our workshop. Is it a V, is it a U, or is it an L-shaped recovery? We should pray for a V. I think it's too late for the V. I think we're on to the U, and hopefully not into the L. So as you think about, your budget, I mean, you've heard the May revision. You got to be ready for anything. That's the governor's projection based on what he knew as of the May revise. And a lot of things can impact that. How long we stay closed, the impact of our top 1%ers, how they're going to behave. And so even though this seems like a very deep cut, and make no mistake, it is, the question will be, how long does it last? And are you going to be ready? So if you go to the next slide, Sarah. Here's the hit on the general fund at the state. These are taxes about 25%. And that's why we have what we have. The next slide, Sarah. So we talk about this in each of our workshops. We got pretty spoiled with Governor Brown. Governor Brown was a very strong politician, and he had the wind at his back as far as the economy went. And we were so used to May coming out and saying, you know what, this is what we're going to adopt our budget on. There's not a big risk factor out there, either economically or policy. So what the governor said in May, it might change a little bit on policy, not much. And on the economics, not much either. Well, this is wildly different. And for those of you who were around last time, you may remember when Governor Schwarzenegger was governor, he'd call special sessions all the time. We would revise the budget we were in currently mid-year, and it usually wasn't a good thing when they were doing that. They only did that to help the state. It wasn't because they wanted to give us more money. And so it could be the wild, wild west. We could get a revision before the end of June. I don't think so. I know Sarah monitors that very closely. The Senate met at the end of on Monday. The Assembly met, I think, yesterday. And so I don't think we're going to get anything other than an adopted budget. But again, the numbers are changing wildly, and we're not going to have all the best information until likely July. So we could, in fact, have an August revision. So if you were around during the Great Recession, you might remember this. The question I get from a lot of people who started after the Great Recession, they'd say, "Do you think they would really cut education that much?" And my answer is, hell yeah. They've done it in the past, and they're going to do it again. They're going to balance the state budget. And unfortunately, we're usually we're part of that, being 40% of the state budget. So we think there's a lot of risk. We think you need to be nimble, start fine-tuning those multi-year projections, start looking at all your accounts as far as for optimal flexibility at the end of the year. And so we think there's a lot of risk to this budget. So Sarah, you want to take the next slide? And this one surprised me, quite frankly. I don't know about you guys, CASBO, Molly, Sarah, or Tasha. When I say it surprised us a little bit, our legislature and prior governors really were hesitant to ever cut funding for our most vulnerable students, typically our free and reduced, our EL, and our foster youth. And during the last recession, we took the lion's share of our cuts in the old system called revenue limits. So think of your base grant under the LCFF. And yes, they did cut categoricals last time, but they pretty much left intact that funding specifically targeted for those most vulnerable students. And so we were a little surprised that they took the cut off the base grant this time and let the supplemental and concentration grants recalculate based on a lower base. And so this is the range of cuts that you might see in your district. These are statewide numbers. And so on the left, those are districts that don't have large populations of those students, and on the right are the districts with larger populations. And so those districts with supplemental and concentration grant cuts are going to take pretty much the same percentage cut, but they're going to take much bigger dollar cuts. And so we were a little surprised by that. And there's an effort to switch that. Our advocacy groups that advocate on behalf of low-income students want that change. Some of our districts with large populations of those students are seeking that change. And so the cuts are pretty significant. They're very significant. The other thing that's out there that we tried to explain at our workshop, FCMAT has actually done a great job with their FCMAT calculator, is clearing up some of the confusion on really how much the cut is. You've heard 10%, you've heard 7.92 or 8%, which is it? Well, if you went to the last recession and how they cut us that time, they did the same thing every time. They would apply the cost of living adjustment, zero that out, and do the cut. And the delta between the funding with that cost of living adjustment compared to the cut, that was the amount of the cut. So we got a 22% cut last time. So as part of the confusion, so if you go on the far left-hand side, to get to the 10% cut, what you basically do is take your 1920 base grant, regardless of which band you're doing, increasing it by the cost of living adjustment by 2.31%, and then applying the 10% cut. Mechanically, how the Department of Finance did it for 2021 is the word was suspended the COLA, and then they applied the 7.92% deficit to the 1920 funding. We've been assured that there was no interest in denying the COLA. And so when you go to your FCMAT calculator in those out years, you'll see those cost of living adjustments, but you'll see an increase in the deficit factor. So For me, I think for your public, for your stakeholders, it's a 10% cut, regardless of the mechanics of cutting at 7.92 on the prior year funding. The fact that you didn't get a cost of living adjustment is a cut because, as most of you know, it costs at least 3.5% to maintain what you did the prior year. And if you don't get that 2.31% COLA, that is in fact a cut. So we're encouraging districts to recognize that that was the entire cut. So Sarah, next slide. All right, so numbers are all over the place. And we called this COLA Wars at our workshop. And I'm just going to take a minute on that. So during the last recession, I have to say, we got really good at our multi-year projections. We fine-tuned them. This is going to be your go-to document as a CBO or a business person in a district. You can't just live in the current year. You got to look at those 2 out years. And so during the last recession, a lot of time and skill was put into those multi-year projections. During the recovery, we got so much money. I'm not saying we didn't put in the same amount of time, but it didn't matter as much because there was always money in those out years to keep us afloat. So here's just 5 different scenarios, and I won't walk through each one of them. The first one's the Department of Finance forecast for those cost of living adjustments. Now, remember, in the past, we've been using those adjustments for our COLAs in the out year. And if you looked at the L8O numbers, and we actually have an economist do it for us, they were all very close. They were different, but very, very close. This time we're wildly different. So you have the DOF COLAs in the out years. I would strongly encourage you not to use those unless you had a contingency plan if they weren't funded, okay? They don't match anybody's that I've seen. So I'm not sure the methodology or what time period they used. But I would highly recommend do not put those in your multi-year without a contingency plan as if they're not funded, whether you reserve it or do something else. But if you look at the cost of living adjustments for the LAO, the U-shaped recovery, L-shaped recovery, you can see where they are. Our economists, we only had them do one scenario. You can see where they are, very minimal. You know, at this point, we've been recommending 0. I was on a call with Mike Fine earlier in the day, and I think he agreed with that. However, we also talked about how rapidly things are changing. And we might actually be in a scenario where maybe those zeros are optimistic. So during the last recession, we had a lot of conversations with the county CBOs. You know, everybody needs to kind of be on the same page. And where we ended up in the last recession is the net effect was planning on 0 COLAs. We didn't get in the business of trying to think about how much is the state going to cut us next time, right? And sometimes it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We actually had an incident during the last recession where the common wisdom is we should plan for a cut in the middle of the year, and most districts budgeted for that. And when it came time to have those discussions, the legislature says, well, they're already ready for it and they already planned for that. So we want to be real careful on what we use as those planning factors. We don't want to give them, well, they already planned for a 10% cut, so I guess they're good, right? And so there's a lot of nuances as CBOs, as business people. You need to know all those scenarios, but what ultimately goes to your board, seek your guidance from your county office CBOs. They're going to make that recommendation. So our recommendation 0. You need to hear from your county office of ed. So Sarah, next slide. All right, okay. So if you have an accounting degree or you're a CPA, just take your certificate off the wall and set it to the side. Unless you were part of the last recession, this is going to violate every accounting principle known to mankind. Common wisdom, those monks many years ago, double entry bookkeeping, the debit credit, right? Well, that's all out the window, and it all started during the last recession. And the reason I'm mentioning it there's a lot of people that weren't around during the last recession, and a lot of you know accounting very well. Heck, if you're listening to a CASBO webcast, you probably know something about accounting, budgeting, leadership, all those things. So one of the tools used last time were deferrals, and those are cash deferrals. And I think if you interviewed most people from the last recession that were in leadership positions, they would tell you we would prefer a deferral over a straight revenue cut. Okay. And so right now the governor is proposing deferrals. So if you think about it, when they cut the LCFF and they say, I'm going to cut you 10%, well, your revenue just went down 10%, and now your budget's likely out of balance. And you're going to go have to figure things out, cut expenditures, do what you need to get that budget in balance. A deferral is a little bit different. A deferral is where, hey, we're supposed to give you some money, but we're not. We're going to hold it. But we want you to book a receivable so your revenues don't go down. And by the way, we're not going to book a payable. And so it was a way for the state to lower its obligation to schools, save the cash for the benefit of the state, and try not to harm you as much as far as your budget goes. So most of your stakeholders are really familiar with revenues and expenditures. Most of them don't know a darn about balance sheets where cash resides, payables, receivables. And so you're going to have to start educating your stakeholders on cash, payables, and receivables. And so what happens is they're going to take your June apportionment, and some of the confusion out there, you keep on hearing the Department of Finance, well, it's $1.9 billion, right? Well, the June payment's about $3 billion. So what do you plan for? You need to plan for taking that whole June apportionment, whatever it is. They're going to take it all. They're going to take that $3 billion. The 1.9 is what they're going to score to Prop 98 to help get them through that year. So you can get wrapped around the axle trying to explain it. What I would say for you and your impact is whatever they were going to pay us in June, they're not going to pay us. They're going to pay us back in July the following year. You're going to book a receivable. And so your worry as a CBO or a business person is, I now have a cash issue. Okay. And I'm sure CASBO's got a lot of trainings for you on how to do that. And so the other deferral is a little bit different. And so it's on the back end of next year. And they've said they're going to take June, May, and part of the April apportionment. And they haven't told us when they'll pay it back. So unlike the first deferral, 1920, we know we're going to get it in July. They haven't stated when we're going to get back the other deferral. My guess, it will be sometime in the first quarter. And what they used last year sometimes, it got so complicated. If you're in charge of managing cash, you're going to be one of the most valuable people in your district. So last time they got so big, so giant, that they were doing deferrals within the year just so they could pay back another deferral. So it was like a Ponzi scheme almost. I didn't say that. Kind of like a Ponzi scheme to help the state get through and to help you get through. So when it comes to deferrals, it's very important you educate your board, your stakeholders, but it's going to be way up here as far as people understanding. And so at the end of the day, you're going to have a cash issue that you're going to need to deal with. When it comes to stakeholders, they're going to have a hard time contemplating it. The other point I want to make. So during the last recession, we all booked receivables and the state didn't book payables and violated every accounting rule known to man. But as an industry with the state, our CPA firms, everyone was on board and we handled it. The reason I want to make that distinction for you, you need to figure out if your auditor was around during that time, and if you have, depending on who your audit firm is, because they're going to have to run it up the flagpole and they're going to go, what the heck? Book a receivable when the state doesn't have a payable? And a lot of our accounting firms have been acquired by national firms. And so you just need to make sure that you have that conversation with the auditor because it might be new to them also. So cash deferrals, here we go again. All right, Sarah, next slide. Okay, you heard this. This is welcome news. STRS and PERS rates go down about 2% for 2 years. Just one of the tools that the state's using to help us. This isn't new money. They took money that they put towards the longer term and put it to the short term. We're very appreciative of that. Next slide. So, and a couple other things. Special ed, we welcome that. That's a battle right now. Sarah can keep you up to date on that. Governor's proposals for the $645 help those lower funded SELPAs. There's pushback that maybe they should allocate it in a different way because some of those higher funded SELPAs don't benefit as much. And so that's one of those discussions happening at the Capitol. But so when it comes to flexibility, the state always, during the last recession, we were cut so deeply, the state kind of loosened the strings to try to help us through the crisis. And in the May revise, the governor proposed some of that. And quite frankly, it wasn't a lot of that. And you're already familiar with that. It wasn't nearly as much as we saw during the last recession. And so just because the governor didn't propose it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. Remember, there's a negotiation all the way to the final budget. And I know CASBO is advocating on your behalf. You know, you're killing us on the revenues. You gotta give us flexibility. And I think CASBO will be the first one to say these flexibility options aren't good for kids, right? They're not designed to be good for kids. They're designed to help you through a fiscal crisis, okay? So just because we're advocating for these things, it's not because we think that's good for students. It's just the fact that school districts aren't going to be able to survive if, in fact, they don't have some flexibility. And so even though the governor didn't propose anything on routine restricted maintenance as a CBO or a business person in a district, you need to be ready if that's part of the flexibility. So, you know, start looking at those balances. Don't spend them unless you have to. There might be flexibility to reduce the instructional year. That's not a fun one, and you have to negotiate it. But what would be your plans if that were to happen? If there's additional flexibility on other categorical funds. So I think as a CBO, you never want to get caught flat-footed. So when something comes out from the state, you can respond rather quickly and say, okay, that's what this means for us. So I'll make a few closing comments on that, and then we can open it on questions. Do I have any more slides, Sarah? One more? Okay, let's see what it says. Oh, okay. This one. So I want to be very thoughtful on how I discuss this. Okay. So if you've been reading your CASBO information, you know that this is an option that might be available for this budget year. And Ed Code basically states in simple terms, if your funding has an increase of less than 2%, it opens up an August layoff window. So a couple things need to happen. One, you need an on-time budget. And so for many years before they enacted the law saying you didn't get paid unless you passed the budget would be approved in September, October. I know, Molly, you remember those days fondly. And so this would never be operative because they didn't have an on-time budget. And the other thing is that funding's less than 2%. So I believe we'll have an on-time budget, and I believe funding will be less than 2% on the LCFF. Now, if you read the actual Ed code on this, it says revenue limit. And Scott Anderson, if you're watching, thank you for that code reference. There is another code that says wherever it says revenue limit, we mean LCFF. So this would be operative. During the last recession, there were 5 instances where this would be enacted, and our legislators shut it down, I think 3 or 4 of those times. And so they just said, you know, that's the law, but as part of the trailer bill language, this is not operative. I'm not expecting them to shut it down. Could they? Yes. But let's think reality here. One of the things you need to keep a calm, cool head, and that's easy for me to say. But if you already did your March 15th and you've right-sized, maybe this isn't an option. I've actually talked to some districts that they don't survive without this option. And so there will be districts taking advantage of it, but be very thoughtful. It's very disruptive, and you spend a lot of time trying to attract and retain those new employees. And if you don't have flexibility in class size, a lot of districts are going to find that this probably isn't a tool they will use, but you need to be aware of it and talk to your HR staff to be ready if in fact this becomes operative. And I'll just give you an example of a couple of discussions that I've had with districts and maybe how to think about it. And when I say keep a calm head, most of you, if I were to take these cuts and put it in your MYP as a second interim, I would be highly surprised if all of you weren't negative in the third year. Many of you will be negative next year or the second year, and then some in the first year. And so how you think about it's important, and how you think about AB 1200, and how you think about talking to your county office of ed. If you don't have, you need to have those discussions with the county office of ed right now. What are your expectations? So I actually had a district that, absent concessions, let's just be honest, the lion's share of our budget is people. Without concessions, they didn't think they were going to make their ending fund balance the following year. It was a 5% district, and they said if we don't make these concessions, we're going to end up at 2.5%. And so I said, what's your relationship with the bargaining unit? And they said, well, it's not too good. I said, well, you don't think they're going to help you out after you show them all this information? Highly unlikely. We think it's going to be difficult. And I said, well, you really need to be thoughtful about how you go forward. So if you don't think they're going to cooperate, next thing you need to ask yourself, is your board going to support you? Because what you're going to have to do is plow through the impasse process with no assistance from your union. And by the way, they're very skilled at making this process take a lot longer than you think it's going to do. And if it comes to the end, are you going to be able to pull off what you need to do, recognizing you already have a budget crisis and you're already going to have a labor crisis? And remember, as far as AB 1200 goes, a reserve for economic uncertainty is that. It's a reserve for economic uncertainty, and it's raining. You don't want to go below zero, but if you need to dip into it below the 5%, what your county office is going to require is that you have a plan to show that you can restore that reserve in the out years. The point I want to make is there are short-term solutions that are going to have a real positive impact, and there's some short-term solutions that might seal your fate as a former employee of the district. Be very thoughtful. You need to think about the long term. And so that whole issue of how fast we recover is going to be important. And the final word on collective bargaining, and then I'll open it up. So during the last recessions, Ron Bennett and I and Maureen Evans went up and down the state negotiating concessions. I will flat out tell you, you're not going to get negotiated concessions from the bargaining unit unless there is something that says if things get better, we get better too. I mean, just flat out, if you someday when funding comes back, we get better. And so a lot of furlough days were negotiated, and there was language that, if funding goes up, we'll start restoring some of those furlough days, things like that. Just be careful. They're going to want restoration language, and you don't want restoration language that's going to put you behind the 8 ball. So I like restoration that says, we're going to measure funding, and when it gets to X, you might get restored. Not automatic kickbacks. So a lot of times districts would negotiate furlough days for 2 years, and then they automatically kick back and they'd need them to go again. And it became very difficult. The other thing that will happen as we seek concessions, and even if we do have contingency language to restore when things get better, you'll get asked for a relaxation of other things that are language items. Like maybe we have some more no-tell days. Maybe we have this. We're going to relax those things in the contract, recognizing that we're in for a tough time. Just be very careful if you negotiate changes in language as a result of requiring concessions from your bargaining units. Remember that when those things are restored, you might want to restore that language. So a lot of districts were left with suboptimal contract language that they acquiesced to during a tough time. And eventually everyone was made whole financially, but those language items still remain, and a lot of districts are still trying to fight back to get that managerial control that they once had. And then final comment, I keep saying final comment. You need to, what's different this time than last time? Last time came really fast. None of the econometric firms predicted it. Major banks failed, and it happened really fast. This is way faster. I mean, we're being hit with a ton of bricks. I guess what I would say a little bit differently this time is I think the awareness is at an all-time high from your stakeholders, the people in your community. They know what's happening. We've shut down our economy. Everyone's at home. People are losing their jobs. People can't go to work because their kids can't go to school. All those types of things. I think it's incumbent on us, and I think this is where CASBO can really be a big help to you, is bringing our stakeholders along for the ride. It is no fun to cut budgets. It's no fun being the person that says, hey, this is how much we need to cut. This is a world crisis. And so I say, bring your stakeholders along for the ride. The last thing you want to be is that villain who comes around and says, this is how much we cut. This is a state problem. So you're not alone. So spending the time to educating your community is going to be very important, because absent a really quick recovery, we're in this for a while. And remember, we usually are lagging a little bit from the national economy. And so even if we start recovering, funding might be not be restored as quickly as the economy is restored. So I guess that's it. Did I filibuster for 43 minutes?
That was great, John. I think before we move on to the member discussion where our members can ask you questions, I think you set a really good segue for us to let our members know that on our advocacy website, our members can see all of our budget positions. We have submitted a statement on the May revise urging for additional flexibility measures, that without that, given the magnitude of reductions, we just can't, this is not the same as the Great Recession, and it triggers back memories. And I apologize to everyone, as I was a budget consultant for the Assembly Budget Committee during the deferral eras. So I feel like I'm paying my share by being an advocate for CASBO. It was very difficult in the Great Recession, but this is not the same, given that under COVID-19, we are being given instructions that we might have to continue social distancing practices if we return physically. And so I know that complicates the situation, and it requires then for us to speak together and speak as one voice, which I'm really proud that CASBO, being a member of the Education Coalition, we are doing so. This is where Education Coalition, a management and labor with PTA group, is strongest, is when we are all fighting for education funding together and to ensure the safety of our students and staff. And so that is something that we're very excited to see reignited. But we want to urge our members to please engage with our elected officials. As John mentioned, on Monday, the Senate held a 6-hour hearing on education finance, and then the entire assembly, all 80 assembly members yesterday, in another 6-hour hearing, were able to vet and listen to finance and the legislative analyst office discuss all of the budget proposals before them, and many of them are still in shock. Many of them were not here prior to the Great Recession. And so for us, it's speaking loudly of, if this is the magnitude coming our way, we do need additional flexibilities. And so we'll urge our members to check out our website and learn about what we're working on as we're advocating on your behalf. Now, in order to participate and ask John a question, there's a raise hand feature icon, and Christina will help us. That is a way that you could sign up to speak or comment. We will also encourage, if you don't feel like commenting verbally, you can enter your question in the Q&A box and Christina will read it. I'll turn it over to Christina to direct her questions to any of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, John. A lot of great questions coming in during the conversation. We're going to take it back a little bit. There have been questions that do mirror each other, so if we don't get to you, please know that your questions and comments are all being recorded and will be reviewed later if we don't get to it today. There are questions. We have a healthy reserve when projecting cuts based on current revenue projections. How will districts with even lower reserves survive these level of cuts? Since we are moving into reductions, will we go back to having a gap and S&C requirement being reduced by the gap MPP?
Okay.
Yeah.
So on the reserve issue, congratulations if these magnitude of cuts mean you have a more than adequate reserve in year 3. You know, I don't want to soft pedal this. During the last recession, we pretty much dismantled public education. We brought it down to our bare bones. We lost vice principals, we lost counselors, we lost athletics, we lost music programs, and at the end of the day, we were barely, and in some instances, we weren't even doing that, doing the minimum required by law. So I have confidence that districts are going to survive if we get the flexibility we need. It's not going to be a fun time. I think the key is how long it lasts. You know, if this is a 1, maybe even a 2-year thing, I have hope that we can come out on the other end. I guess what I'm thinking about now, because this impacts school services, this impacts CASBO. I mean, during the last recession, we weren't unscathed, and I know CASBO wasn't unscathed. So if I'm the CBO and thinking about, you know, how do I want to get through this? I want to get through it with my best staff still intact, with the best information and training available. And so I'm not sure about your questions on the UPP. One of the things people are asking is flexibility to use supplemental concentration grants differently. And I don't think you're going to get something specific like that from the legislature. I think they're going to say current law allows you through your LCAP to decide what you're going to do. So I'm not confident that you're going to get relief on, okay, you can use supplemental and concentration grant dollars for anything you want. I think they believe there's enough flexibility in the current regulations that you can control through your LCAP. Every time I hear a proposal on that, it's usually met with a hard no. I don't know if you're hearing anything different, Molly or Sarah. Nope. I don't know if I answered the whole question, but it was a long question.
Yeah, I'm grouping them together as they seem to match. We have some questions from the audience. Is it safe to assume that the STRS on behalf can be removed from expenditures when calculating the 3% RRM contribution? Additionally, is there any guidance out there on how to budget for on behalf STRS and PERS for 2020-21?
Okay, yeah, I think you're pretty safe to do that. That's a solution that everybody liked, and I think that's going to last as long as we're in this situation. It's flexibility that I think doesn't really cost the state anything, and it came from the field. You know, it was an idea coming from chief business officials, so I'm confident that that's going to stick, and I think it goes forward. I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of a nonsensical thing anyway, and we're just fixing it. So I'm pretty confident you can plan on that. I don't know if your guys are hearing anything on the CASBO end. Yeah, it
And
costs the
it's
state nothing, and it's flexibility that's needed. And you can argue for an hour that it was nonsensical in the first place.
And it's currently in the May revised proposal. The administration took that as one of our recommendations. But then there is another component that your slide also raises. Should we suspend or temporarily reduce the requirement in the RRMA as well?
Yeah, I would not be surprised. You can't count on that yet. But when I said plan, what would you do if that was in? So if you can, that means you stop spending now, just be prepared to take advantage of the maximum flexibility. I don't think you need to be ready if more flexibility comes. So for like all the issues, I mean, I would hold off on spending right now as much as you can. Try to drive up that ending fund balance when you close. And if there is flexibility, more flexibility, you can take advantage of it.
Thank you, John. I have a few questions about instructional minutes and ADA. Any news on flexibility on distance learning as it applies to instructional minutes? Also, what does it mean by hold harmless for 20/21? Does it mean that there may be, does this mean it may be possible to be funded on the 18-19 ADA for 20/21? And further, is there any update on the flexibility for distance learning as it applies to instructional minutes and days?
I have some lobbyists that could answer that question. I'm not sure where they are on that. I think for ADA, I don't think the rules change with the exception they allowed P2 to be February 29th. We've gotten questions on, okay, the emergency order expires in July that says we can use February 29th. Does that mean next year we don't get to use that if we're declining enrollment for prior year enrollment? And I'd say, no, you're going to use February 29th because they didn't collect P2 this year. So flexibility on instructional minutes and days, that's some flexibility that they did in fact use last time. But Sarah, I'm not part of that latest conversations on that. So I'll come to you on what you think.
And I'm fortunate enough to live in those conference calls with both the Senate and the Assembly. They are very sympathetic and very supportive. I think we have to do a final push where we have to explain that in order to continue doing hybrid models and building out blended learning systems, incorporating distance learning, as well as preparing should we shut down again, it is important to have these flexibilities. So I would continue to urge our members to reach out to their legislators to let that sink in. We have to walk that fine line of letting folks know that what we're not doing is not saying we're not going to provide these services and we want just a blank check of saying don't hold us accountable, but it really is then to allow you those opportunities to build out multiple models and plan out multiple scenarios should we be able to reopen in the fall. And so for us, it's one of our top priorities that we're advocating on your behalf.
This is Molly. I just wanted to make a comment about this. Your local legislators need to understand how this is really impacting your district. When CASBO is doing this, we have a great legislative committee, and Sarah and Elizabeth are awesome at sharing information. But when, Fred Flintstone hears about what's happening in his town and with his school district, that's going to have an enormous impact on that local senator or assembly person. So as you're talking about the difficulty and what it's going to be like I think we should go to enrollment based as opposed to ADA and how we're doing it. But if we're going to continue to do things as we've done, they need to understand the challenges that you have in those things. Because one of the things I know in Sacramento is we tend to have these conversations at a very high level without thinking about the impact of what's actually happening on the ground, how it's impacting individual school districts. So if you have good scenarios, if you have good examples, please share them with us. but also share them locally, because, you know, those folks have to come back to your community. They have to look you in the eye, and they have to justify why they've taken the actions that they've taken.
I like the Fred Flintstone reference. Molly and I are contemporaries.
And then the final round of questions that I'll group together has to do with layoff notices for LEAs, as well as potential hiring freezes, if that can be a possibility before layoffs. And does the second layoff timeline also apply to certificated administration, and how much of their 2020-21 salary would have to be paid?
Okay, there's a lot of questions in there, and I believe it applies to all certificated, and I'm not 100% on that. And the other part was, to me, my recollection of it, there weren't a lot of districts that took advantage of it last time. It's just you basically get the benefit of the whole following year, because the layoff actually occurs ideally before school starts. And I wouldn't tread into that one. I would make sure that you consider all the ramifications of doing that. Most districts, I mean, just to be frank, we're welcoming that layoff window. And by the way, a lot of you might need to take it depending on how you're sitting going into this recession. But a lot of times districts really thought it through, and the mechanics, and you know, if you had schedules set and that sort of thing, and did not do it. But if you need to balance your budget, you need to balance your budget, and if that's one of the tools, you need to use it. So if you want a more technical answer, you can email me and I'll get somebody who actually knows what they're doing to answer that. We actually have HR people in school services, and that isn't me. I just say, we need to cut that much.
And then lastly, just on the federal funds, the administration is proposing to provide $4.4 billion in CARES funds for schools. Any insights in terms of, can the funds be used only for new expenditures or existing expenditures? And will it be subject to the supplanting limitations?
So my gut feeling, regardless of what it says now, it's really no help if you have to. I mean, I believe a lot of this is one to provide for what they intend. My experience last time with the ARA funds, they came out initially, it's to be used this way, and everyone said, well, you know, that's not really that helpful to us. So I'm expecting maybe a loosening of those requirements, the supplements, supplant, because that was absent from the ARA funds. And really, we're in a financial crisis, and these funds are, in my opinion, to aid districts. So I'm hopeful that they relax that a little bit. The mechanics of how you get it, I think that's being hotly debated, and I know Sarah's in the middle of those conversations. The current methodology of, well, there's students with disabilities will get a portion of it, and the governor's proposal is that only concentration grant districts get it. And so that's a hotly debated item. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah, the Senate already said we'd like to allocate those funds differently based on UPP, but having nothing to do whether you're a concentration district or not. So I think that's a hotly debated issue, and that's going to be evolving. So that's my quick take on it.
And then the last question, it has to do with any insights on school opening and the position that unions might take on this issue.
Well, you know, it's interesting. We thought the guidelines would come out today. I think they've been postponed to tomorrow. And my gut tells me there's not a lot of there's a lot of shoulds in there, and not a lot of you musts, because they don't want to have a state mandate and actually to pay for it. You know, it's hard to say. I can't say there's a blanket response. I think a lot of it is on the relationship. I have two daughters that are teachers, and when COVID came around, my one daughter's in a district that has very positive relations. They work together, and they work things out rather quickly and hit the ground running and did what was best for students, regardless of what the mantra was. In other districts, I mean, they're trying to get every dime they can, or every change in working conditions as possible. And I'm sure they're getting guidance from the mothership. But at the end, I think it's going to come down with your relationships with your bargaining units. And so it's hard to say there's a one size fits all. I'm surprised every day. I think it comes down to people and how you've treated each other in the past and how you go forward.
John,
And
sorry, Sarah. I know we've come to the end of our time. I just want to let everyone know, first, we appreciate all the great questions that you have asked, and we will commit to getting these answered for you and turning these back out to you as a resource. So if your question wasn't answered by John today, we know for sure that he's going to sign up some more time and help us get these important questions answered. And Sarah, I'll turn it back to you, but I just wanted to make sure we communicated with you. These will be answered for you.
And thank you so much, John, for your time. As part of our presentation, we've included resources that we've put together on the topic of reopening. They're also posted on our website. You're always welcome to send us emails should you have any questions. As Tasha mentioned, our goal is to make sure that we answered all these questions in a timely fashion, and we're going to continue to advocate on behalf. Many of the issues you raised in questions are things that we're advocating on your behalf. So thank you so much, John, for your time. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, John.